Well, joining us on the phone from Boston, Massachusetts is Noam Chomsky, the professor from MIT. Noam Chomsky, obviously the markets are all down. In your propaganda model, you lay great store by the commercial interests in the media. I guess the media that has been saying that there wasn't grave economic problems in the system. But if the markets are collapsing, presumably a downturn in advertising, will we expect better corporate media?
I don't see any reason to expect that. The structure of the media, their institutional structure, remains unchanged. In fact, apart from investment banks, the general institutional structure of the state capitalist system remains the same. There may be some modifications. I mean, obviously the media can't overlook the financial crisis. It is indeed very serious. No one doubts that. So yes, they recognize it. But in fact, it was predictable and predicted. Also, the reasons for it were understood long ago, and they have barely been given expression in the media, or for that matter, by most economists, although some knew and wrote about it.
Of course, independent media, often independent media that certainly promoted your work, predicted all of this and predicted a market collapse. Do you think investors are beginning to realize, though, that corporate media isn't trustworthy? And certainly unemployment rates seem to be going up in the United States, look set to be going up. Can we expect a shift in attitudes in the United States?
Well, popular attitudes in the United States are highly negative towards the media and, in fact, towards all institutions. So this doesn't get reported, but editors know the polls perfectly well. About 80% of the population says that the country is run, I'm quoting, by a few big interests looking out for themselves, meaning corporations, not for the people. About 95% of the population objects to the fact that the government doesn't pay any attention to public opinion. I don't remember the exact numbers on the media, but the negative attitudes are very high, and in fact are very high for just about every institution. We read about George Bush's historically low popularity rating, in fact very low, but the fact is Congress is even more unpopular.
And we've had politicians in Europe and Russia talking about the end of U.S. hegemony. Even if the U.S. cannot pay its bills, it still has the largest military on earth. You've written about that power of that military. Doesn't that military in itself confer power?
Oh, sure. And I don't agree with the conclusions about loss of U.S. hegemony. I mean, first of all, this crisis, this financial crisis, is very likely going to hit Europe even harder than the United States. Several European countries have already declared official recession, which the United States hasn't. Banks are collapsing rapidly in Europe. The immediate problem, not the deep problem, but the immediate one is what are called toxic assets, mortgage-based securities. And about half of these are held, we don't have the details, but it's all very not transparent. But the general estimates are about half of them are held in European banks. One country, Iceland, is practically on the verge of declaring bankruptcy because of its enormous exposure to the tides of financial liberalization.
Just before we go to Paris, I know one of our guests wants to ask you just one question, because I know you're very busy, Professor Chomsky, but what about supranational institutions, the Security Council, the International Court? We seem to be seeing a waning of some U.S. power, Beijing and Moscow vetoing decisions at the Security Council, certainly on Iran, and the decision by the General Assembly, of course, not the Security Council, but to refer the recognition of Kosovo.
We saw that, but that's normal. The U.S. is, in fact, it's interesting to see the reporting of it since you bring up the media. The vote, which I think was 77-6 or something like that, it was reported that there was that there was a division in the vote and that it was polarized. But what was not reported was that the U.S. Joining the United States were Albania, the Marshall Islands, Palau, I think probably Israel, practically nobody. But that's normal. For example, on the embargo against Cuba, the regular votes in the UN year after year are, on the order of 180 to 4 or something like that, with the U.S. supported only by Israel and a few Pacific islands. That usually doesn't even get reported. So that's absolutely nothing new. As far as the Security Council is concerned, what is not too well known, because it also doesn't get reported, is that since the United Nations pretty much fell out of control by the 1960s as a result of decolonization, and the recovery of other industrial countries, since the mid-60s, the United States is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Britain is second, and no one else is even close. So we're not seeing anything new in terms of isolation of the United States in the international institutions. The U.S. is also the only country right now that has rejected a World Court decision, an official World Court decision. It had been joined earlier by Albania and Libya, but they've since accepted them. So this isolation is consistent. As for U.S. hegemony, it is based on objective factors. One is what you mentioned, the military. The U.S. has, the U.S. military is approximately at the scale of the rest of the world combined and far ahead technologically. But it's also a very rich country with plenty of resources. It's homogeneous, unlike Europe. Europe is roughly on the same scale economically, but it's not homogeneous. You can see that in the reactions to the financial crisis. In the United States, they're uniform, taken by the federal government. In Europe, they're national and not consistent. For about 35 years, it's been clear, I've written about it, so have others, that the world is becoming more diverse. It's becoming what has been called tripolar, with 3 major economic centers, though only 1 military center. The economic centers are North America, based in the United States, Western Europe, based on Germany, mostly France, and Northeast Asia, based on Japan, increasingly China. South Korea is a major industrial power. And those 3 regions, now India is partially joined in, and Southeast Asia, those are 3 major centers of economic power. They differ substantially in their characteristics, and to some extent, to less of an extent than is often claimed, in my opinion, but to some extent, the Asian center, the Northeast Asian center, mostly Northeast Asian center, is increasing in its role in world affairs. That's very clear that we can see it in this crisis.
Professor Chomsky, I'm just going to go over to Max Keiser, because I think we're running out of satellite time there in Paris. Max, I know you wanted to ask a question of Professor Chomsky just before we go on to talk about the markets.
Sure. Professor Chomsky, I was wondering if you could comment on something. Those of us who cover markets and finance have noticed that there's a new propaganda model, if you will. Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke are able to manipulate prices in the markets to get things done like this $850 billion bailout package. So it harkens to the manufacturing consent and propaganda model, of course, from your work. And I'm wondering if you have noticed this, if you can comment on this, because it seems this idea of manufacturing consent and the propaganda model has now morphed into the markets, these guys are now manipulating prices to get policies through and to get public acceptance for their policies. Any comment on that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
Not the whole of the question. Well, Max was saying whether your propaganda model could be extended to the propaganda model for, reinforcing prices within the market. And in fact, that propaganda model exerting a huge impact on the way the markets are run and then the way the people then bail out those markets.
Well, mean, there are certain analogies, but it doesn't literally apply. The propaganda model has to do with, specifically with the behavior of the primary mass media, the corporate media, the state media, in slightly different conditions.
But we
the
know
way the markets
know,
work is, there are different.
But we know, but we know that
operating.
But I would disagree. We know that Bernanke and Paulson can influence public opinion by behaviorally causing a shift in psychology by dropping prices and scaring people to.
No, that's true.
So
government officials can certainly influence psychology, but that's not the same dynamics as the way the corporate media function.
Okay, but if you're manipulating corporate media and images to create a psychological behavioral response, and isn't it analogous to go into the marketplace and say, look, we want the Dow Jones to drop 5,000 points to scare people into accepting our bailout package to fund the Pentagon, to fund the war machine?
It's undoubtedly true that statements by government officials can influence the market, but I really don't think that Paulson was calling for a sharp decline in the market. In fact, that's harmful to his interests.
Interesting.
Well,
Professor Chomsky, we'll have to take that up another time. Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for joining us. We will be hopefully speaking to you soon as the current economic crisis continues. Max, we only have a couple of minutes, I think, left on the satellite, but it seems to be the rating agencies that are being blamed for the downturn in the Dow. But, of course, is no one talking about retribution against those rating agencies?
Well, on any given day, they're going to scapegoat somebody new. They don't want to talk about the true underlying problem, is that for the last 10 years, there's been a shadow banking system. Tens of trillions of dollars worth of bad debt has been kept off the balance sheet of the banks. It's been kept off the public's balance sheets. And now all of these dead bodies are floating to the surface, and suddenly people are noticing that there's a lot of corpses around. And they are getting scared, and they are panicking because they now know that the U.S. economy is not growing. The U.S. economy has been in a recession now for more than a year. There's been negative GDP in America for more than a year. We know that unemployment is really at closer to 12% than the 6% that the government is talking about. We know that the money supply numbers are skyrocketing. We know that the U.S. economy is in dire shape and sinking quite rapidly. But nobody in government wants to talk about this because they are too chicken.
Yeah, got a graph from Shadow Stats showing that some people think that the GDP decline started much earlier than everyone's talking about at the moment.
Well, that GDP number is a cooked number because they misstate inflation. Inflation, according to the government, using the inflation's deflator number, is based on a very select basket of goods, which would have us believe that the price of gas and food over the past year has only increased by 1%. Anyone who's been to the gas station or bought food in the last year knows that these prices have gone up 7, 8, 9%. If you subtract that deflator from the GDP number, you end up with negative GDP. And that's the simple fact.
And just finally, Max, because we are running out of that satellite time, obviously we spoke to Noam Chomsky, someone who puts a great store by the people themselves. I noticed AIG spent $440,000 of the $85 billion loan going to St. Regis Resort. I think we have a picture of that resort. How do you think the American people are viewing this at the moment?
Well, not only that, but I heard they stole the towels from the bathroom.
Yeah, well, we're trying to get that picture up, but
it's
quite a nice place.
Afshin, last year I did a report talking about how the CIA, to do extraordinary rendition in Milan, Italy, checked into the finest hotel in Milan and spent $500,000 over the course of a couple of weeks to go kidnap a man illegally in Italy and extradite him to Egypt. So these government officials are quite used to the high life and the high style on the U.S. taxpayer tab. Of course, that's what you'd expect from a very high-class criminal. These guys are put the Gambino family to shame.
Except, of course, they're not government officials, or are they government officials now that they've been bailed out?
Well, exactly. This is the fascist model. You don't know where the one starts and the other ends. When the Pentagon, when it becomes JP Pentagon or Goldman Sachs Blackwater, who's to say which is which? There's all blended into one huge, colossal money laundering slush fund. The objective is to go start preemptive wars. I'm afraid we're all Palestinians now, Afshin. We all know what it feels like to live in Blackwater's ghetto.
We're all Palestinians. Well, Max Keiser, live from Paris, and of course, Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for joining us.